Yesterday we looked at the four jobs that the digestive system has to do. So there's ingestion, there's chemical and physical digestion, there's absorption, and there's elimination. So we started to look at the GI tract. We looked at structures in the mouth. We looked at the epiglottis, the flap of tissue that is supposed to prevent food from entering into the trachea, the windpipe, right? That doesn't always work 100%, but most of the time it works pretty well. Then the food is passed past the epiglottis and the pharynx into the esophagus, where peristalsis takes over and causes that food to travel down the esophagus toward the first valve that we find between the stomach and the esophagus. Does anyone remember what that one-way valve, that round muscular sphincter was called at the top of the stomach, but at the bottom of the esophagus? Right. So sometimes it's referred to as the cardiac sphincter because it's kind of located right around where your heart would be. But another name for it, and a more common name for it, is the esophageal sphincter. Okay, because it's kind of the passageway between the esophagus and the stomach. So located right where the esophagus meets the stomach, right here, we have our esophageal sphincter. Now, the reason why we have a window there is because inside the stomach we find acid, and that acid is almost comparable to the acid you'd find in a car battery, all right, which is really, really, really corrosive. It's like pH of 2. It's a strong acid. So what we want to prevent is we want to prevent that acid from entering into the esophagus where the esophagus is not protected from it. So we have this esophageal sphincter, which allows food to go in, but if it's working properly, doesn't allow the backsplash of acid back into the esophagus. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is kind of what happens after food passes through that esophageal sphincter. We're going to look at what happens in the stomach today. So the stomach is a J-shaped muscular sac. And again, a lot of people think that the stomach is in the belly area, right? They say, oh, I have a stomach ache, and it's in your belly. No, your intestines are down there. Your stomach is actually, if you feel that rib, okay, kind of on the left-hand side, if you feel that rib, it's kind of sits right behind the liver. So the liver would be right there, and then behind the liver would be your stomach. Okay, and it kind of sits. Your liver is more kind of on your right-hand side toward the center, and then your stomach kind of sits on your left-hand side. So food drops from your pharynx, where your Adam's apple is, and it drops down about 30 centimeters, and your stomach would be right down where your rib cage is. Now, your stomach can shrink and enlarge. So if you eat a really big meal, your stomach will actually stretch to accommodate that. So it can get smaller and it can get larger, like an accordion. You guys know the musical instrument, the accordion, right? It's got folds in it, right? And you can open it up to allow air in there, and then you can press it to allow air to escape. Your stomach has folds like that as well, and they are called rugae. Okay, rugae. So if you look at a stomach, and hopefully we have time to go into the lab and you can dissect the little piggy, and you can open up the pig's stomach and you'll see these rugae. And they allow for the accommodation of the stomach to stretch. Now, in your average human, the stomach can stretch to about 1.5 liters. If you are a chronic overeater and you constantly eat more and more and more, you can actually cause the stomach to stretch bigger and bigger and bigger, so that it takes you longer to get more full. So what happens is when you hit that 1.5 liter kind of capacity, hormones are secreted by the stomach, as well as nerve impulses go to your brain telling you you're full, don't eat anymore. So again, if you stretch that stomach, you can kind of bypass those signals and eat more and more. And the opposite is true. If you eat very small meals, the stomach can actually shrink a little bit, and you get full faster. So here is a stomach that's actually been taken out of an organism. I would probably say that's probably a pig if I had to guess. They use pig organs a lot to demonstrate what happens in humans because pigs have a very similar body physiology compared to humans. Their organs are really close to ours as far as shape and size. So my guess would be this would be a pig stomach. And what it was taken out, it's alive. And you can see that the stomach it's not just kind of a inactive sac for your food. It's actually really active and it's layered in layers of muscles. Okay, so just like your esophagus has ring-like muscles that allow peristalsis to push food down in the stomach also has layers of muscle. And when food hits the stomach, and actually even before food hits the stomach, these muscles start to contract and turn and need what the contents of it. So mechanical digestion continues in the stomach, right? So mechanical digestion starts in your mouth where we chew our food, okay, and mix it with saliva, right? We break it up. That increases surface area. But the stomach also acts to agitate your food and continue to kind of twist it and kind of knead it, right? And squish that food. When your stomach is empty and you're hungry, you know that rumbling you get in your stomach? That's actually your stomach doing this, but it's empty and there's some fluid in there and it kind of causes the fluid to kind of go through the rugae and it makes that rumbling sound. Believe it or not, they actually have a scientific name for it. Borborygmi. Borborygmi. Yeah, borborygmi. That's the actual sound that your stomach makes when it's empty and it's gurgling around. Okay, so please, again, it's these little things, and you guys, you know this now from writing a test, right? You know it's these little tiny things that can creep up on you and cost you marks. I won't ask you what Berbergrami is. I can't even pronounce it. I'm not going to ask it to you. But I may ask you, where in your body does mechanical digestion occur? And a lot of people just say, oh, just your mouth, because we have teeth, we chew it. But no, it continues on in your stomach as well. So when you eat, food enters into the stomach and the stomach is stretched. And when the stomach gets stretched, there are special cells in the stomach that are stimulated and they produce a chemical that goes out into your bloodstream. Chemical messengers that are carried by your blood are called hormones. Now, in Biology 30, there's an entire chapter. We spend a whole chapter looking at a bunch of different hormones. I'm sure you guys have talked about hormones before, right? You're in puberty right now. Hormones are coursing through your bodies, but you probably don't really know what a hormone is. You've heard the term. A hormone is a chemical messenger that's carried by your bloodstream. Okay. So, for example, we talked about human growth hormone the other day. It's secreted by the pituitary gland in your brain, and it tells your muscles to grow. It tells your bones to grow. Okay, so that's secreted into your bloodstream. It travels throughout your body, goes to all the cells in your body, and it tells your cells to grow. All right. When your stomach gets stretched, a hormone is secreted by your stomach. It goes out into the bloodstream. Okay, and it travels a very short distance to other cells in your stomach, and it tells those cells to secrete what's called gastric juice. All right, so gastric juice is made up of a number of different things: acid, mucus, and this stuff called pepsin, right, which we'll talk about in a second. All right, so just so you guys understand, what happens is food enters into the stomach. Okay, so food will travel from the esophagus into the stomach. And as the stomach stretches out, what happens is this hormone called gastrin is actually released out into the bloodstream. All right, so gastrin would be released from the wall of the stomach and immediately goes into the bloodstream. And it doesn't travel far. So it goes a short little hop and then it comes back and goes to other cells in the stomach and it sends a message to them and it tells them to release gastric juice. All right, now there are nerve impulses that'll tell your stomach to do this as well. So for example, if you smell, when I remember my classroom in O'Leary was right by the cafeteria, and the guy in the cafeteria would make bacon every day around this time. And man, that bacon would waft, the smell would waft into my room, and right away, my stomach would start growling, right? So we do actually get nerve impulses that tell our stomach to produce this as well, but it really gets amplified when our stomach stretches, okay? And that sends a chemical message to tell our stomach to produce this stuff called gastric juice. Now, gastric juice is produced by special cells in what are called gastric pits in our stomach, and that's secreted into the stomach, not the bloodstream. Okay, so gastric juice is produced by special cells in your stomach. When you smell food, when you think about food, when you actually eat food, this gastric juice gets secreted by these, they're called gastric pits. They're little kind of pores in your stomach, and they're lined with these special cells. There's a bunch of different types of cells in there called parietal cells and chief cells and mucus producing cells. And they produce this gastric juice. And the gastric juice enters into the stomach and it starts to digest some macromolecules that are found in the food that you've just swallowed. So what you guys need to know is that gastric juice is made up of three components. It's made up of hydrochloric acid, it's made up of mucus, and it's made up of this stuff called pepsinogen. Okay, so together, these three things make up gastric juice. Now, each of those three components has a job to do. So the hydrochloric acid, it takes the pH of your stomach and it lowers it to between 2 and 3 on the pH scale. So very acidic. Now, many people think that it's the acid in your stomach that actually breaks down your food, and that's not the case. Okay? The acid actually doesn't do much to your food as far as digestion goes. What it does is it helps to kill pathogens. Does anyone know what a pathogen is? Well, I have it right there. It's any harmful organism. Okay, pathogen actually means a bringer of misery. So a pathogen is any organism that's going to cause you to get sick. So viruses, bacteria, fungi, any type of parasitic organism like worms and that sort of thing. So when this stuff hits your stomach, it's the job of the acid to try and kill that stuff. All right, so your stomach acid is what we call the first line of defense. That means that, inevitably, if I were to take my sandwich and put it on my desk, there are bacteria and viruses on my desk. Okay, regardless of how clean it is, and floating in the air, there's little spores of fungus and all sorts of things. So what happens is if my sandwich is not too contaminated, then my stomach acid can deal with those pathogens and they don't get into the rest of my body. Now, if I eat something that's really spoiled or has a very high load of pathogens, then the acid might not kill them all. It can get into my lower digestive tract and it can make me very sick, such as like E. coli poisoning or salmonella poisoning or botulism. That is a huge bacterial load, and this is not enough to stop it. That's when my immune system would have to deal with it. Okay, so it's just kind of a first line of defense. Now, in addition to making the stomach very acidic and making it a very inhospitable place for pathogens, the acidic environment also activates an enzyme called pepsin. Now, we talked about pepsin when I talked to you guys about enzyme activity, right? I talked to you about two enzymes, pepsin and trypsin. And I mentioned that most enzymes in the body work around a pH of between 6.5 and 7.5. Okay, that's where most enzymes work. But there is an enzyme in your body that works under different pH conditions, and it's called pepsin. Now, pepsin will only work between about the pH of around 2 to 4. So it will not work unless it's a very acidic environment. So hydrochloric acid not only helps to kill pathogens, but it allows pepsin to go to work. Now, what does pepsin do? Pepsin's job is to take large proteins and digest them into smaller polypeptide chains. You guys remember the difference between a protein and a polypeptide? So if you'll recall, a polypeptide is a big, long, straight chain of amino acids. What's the difference? What's a protein? Right, it's twisted up and it's three-dimensional. So pepsin's job is to take those twisted up proteins and basically stretch them out and maybe make one or two cuts. Okay, so by no means does pepsin fully digest proteins. Okay, it starts the digestion process of proteins, but it doesn't complete it. Okay, so all pepsin does is it kind of untwists the proteins and maybe makes a couple of chops, but it doesn't do the fine work, all right, of breaking them down into amino acids. That's still yet to come. So all that happens in the stomach as far as chemical digestion goes is large proteins are broken down into polypeptides. Okay, that's it. That's all the chemical digestion that occurs in your stomach. Nothing else is broken down. Starch does not get broken down. Fat does not get broken down. Disaccharides do not get broken down. Polypeptides do not get broken down. The only thing that happens in the stomach is pepsin untwists and unwinds the proteins and kind of chops them up a bit. That's it. All right? So let's think about this for a second. I told you earlier that gastric juice contained mucus. Mucus helps to coat your food and it helps to kind of mix your food. Mucus also coats the outside or the inside of your stomach. All right. So what mucus does is it provides a layer between the acid in your stomach and the actual cells of your stomach. All right. Yes. Yeah. That's same kind of thing. Same kind of mucus in your stomach. What that mucus is doing is it's kind of lubricating your food. So that, you know, I told you guys yesterday when you swallow that one chip and it kind of slides down, if you're eating too fast, if you chew enough, you kind of coat it in mucus, slimy mucus, and it's much easier to swallow. Okay? Your stomach also produces mucus in much greater amounts. So it's going to produce this mucus, it's going to coat your stomach, and it's going to kind of lubricate your food some more. All right? The other thing that gets produced, hydrochloric acid. What does hydrochloric acid do? Lowers the pH, which helps to kill the bacteria. The third thing that's produced by your stomach cells is this stuff called pepsinogen. And I want you to make note of this inogen ending. We're going to see this a lot. Inogen means inactive. Inactive means that it doesn't work. Okay, it's not ready to work yet. Now, pepsinogen is produced by your stomach cells and it's inactive. And as soon as it hits hydrochloric acid, okay, as soon as the pepsinogen hits the hydrochloric acid, it is now turned on. And it becomes pepsin. Now, why would nature do this? Why would we evolve this system? Why doesn't the stomach cell just make pepsin? Well, just a minute ago, I told you what pepsin breaks down. What does it break down? Proteins. What is the majority of your cell? Protein. So if the cell made pepsin, what would happen to the cell? It would self-destruct, right? So instead of making pepsin, the cell makes pepsinogen, which is inactive. It doesn't do anything. And as soon as that pepsinogen enters into the stomach and we have acid there, it gets turned on. And then it can digest your food. Now, why doesn't it digest your stomach? What's coating your stomach? Mucus, right? So we have that layer of mucus, which helps to protect the stomach cells as soon as the pepsin it gets turned on. Okay. Now, there are certain conditions where your stomach might not make enough mucus, or you might have an infection in your stomach where the mucus layer doesn't coat the stomach, and the pepsin will actually eat a hole through your stomach. Does anyone know what that's called? An ulcer, exactly, a gastric ulcer or a peptic ulcer. So we can have ulcers all over our body. An ulcer just means basically a hole. You can have a diabetic ulcer on your foot from from infections. You can have an ulcer ulcer just means that you're starting to make a hole in a tissue layer. A perforated ulcer means that the ulcer has gone all the way through. So if you get a perforated gastric ulcer, what can actually happen is that pepsin and acid and food and stuff can actually leak out into your body cavity. It's very dangerous. Plus you bleed, right? There's bleeding ulcers. Yeah. Yeah. No, so not your stomach. That's actually your large intestine. So you can actually get ulcerated colitis, it's called. So Crohn's and colitis is much more severe than like a gluten intolerance. And if it becomes ulcerative colitis, it can get so bad that your large intestine is just full of holes and they actually have to remove it. Yeah. So what they thought in the old days is what. So the answer or the question was why do you get these holes in the mucus layer? Like why doesn't it just coat everything? And what they thought in the old days is you were nervous maybe and you just didn't produce enough, or you ate spicy food or you drank too much coffee or too much booze or whatever. What they now know is that a lot of these ulcers are actually caused by a bacteria called H. pylori that can actually live in pH of 2. They didn't think any living thing could actually exist in those environments, but they found this bacteria that can actually live in there. And if your immune system gets run down, or for whatever reason you're susceptible to these infections, the bacteria can start to eat away at that area, and it doesn't produce mucus. I think we all have it. It's just that some people are more susceptible for it to take root, right? It's kind of like warts. Like we all have the virus that causes warts, like 95% of us. But why aren't we always walking around with warts? Little kids tend to get warts more often, but eventually your immune system kind of gets used to the virus and knows how to kill it off, right? So it's the same kind of thing with this stuff. Like, why doesn't everybody have a peptic ulcer if we all have H. pylori in our stomachs? Just some people are better able to fight it off than other people. And again, other conditions can impact your immune system, like stress, like alcohol, and other people are just more sensitive to it. So the way they treat ulcers now is they actually give you an antibiotic, and it kind of cures up the infection, and then that part of the stomach can heal, produce the mucus, and you aren't susceptible to it. All right, so the thing that I need you guys to understand is that pepsin is not secreted by your gastric cells, okay? Because if pepsin were made by the cells, it would actually destroy the cells. So pepsinogen gets made by the cells. It's inactive. Once it hits a pH of 2, it becomes activated and it starts to break down the proteins in your food and not the proteins that make up your cells, okay? So we used to do an experiment where we would take chicken, a piece of chicken, which is very high in protein, and I would put that chicken in a vial of hydrochloric acid, pure hydrochloric acid, and then I would take some pepsin, like you guys used in the lab the other day, right? And I would take that pepsin and I would dissolve it in water, and I'd put it into a vial, and then I would take pepsin and HCl, combine it together, put it into a vial, and then we'd take this and we'd heat it in an incubator at 37 degrees. Why would I heat it at 37 degrees? It's body temperature, and that's the optimal temperature for for enzymes to work, right? Now the problem is when I did this, the smell is, oh man, I'm almost going to throw up just thinking about it. It's like a dead body. So people would complain up and down that hallway in the biolab. So I don't do it anymore. But the last time I did it, I took some pictures. Okay. Now, this is a piece of chicken in the 3 different solutions. Notice the chicken in the hydrochloric acid. It's been sitting there for a while, by the way, a couple of days. What do you notice about the chicken in the acid? Nothing's happened to it, right? So hopefully that dispels the myth that acid digests your food. It did nothing to the chicken. Now look when I put pepsin in water. What's the pH of water? Pure water. 7. Does pepsin work under a pH of 7? No. Notice the chicken. Very little has happened to it, right? Now look what happens when I put pepsin and HCl together. What happens to the pepsin? It's activated, right? Because we're in a pH of 2. Notice what happened to the chunk of chicken. It's gone. It's been dissolved into polypeptides, right? So the actual protein of the chicken muscle is gone. So once we add the pepsin and the HCl together, it becomes very powerful in getting rid of those proteins. Okay, make sense? Okay. So mucus is part of that gastric juice. And mucus does a pretty good job of lubricating the food and protecting the stomach. But as good a job as mucus does, some of that pepsin and acid still gets to the stomach cells. And we are constantly making new stomach cells. In fact, the life of a stomach cell is about 3 days, right? It's under tremendous chemical pressure, and we need to make new stomach cells all the time. So that's a scope that's been put down somebody's throat, down their esophagus, and into the stomach. What do you notice about the walls of the stomach? It's kind of glistening. That's the mucus. And is it smooth? No. What are those ridges called? Do you remember? Rugae. Rugae. Right. Okay, that's the ridges in the stomach. So we talked about ulcers, gastric ulcers or peptic ulcers. There is, again, a scope right down into the stomach. And sometimes that's how they have to diagnose these things, is they put a scope down into your stomach. They actually take a look. This is a really bad ulcer. This is almost perforated right through the wall of the stomach there. You can see the rugae all around it. Notice how the rugae away from the ulcer are nice and pink. Notice the color around the ulcer. Very red, right? It's inflamed. Okay, that's the immune system trying to fight off that damage. So because of a bacterial infection, usually it's by that H. pylori, Heliobacter pylorus, and it can cause damage to that mucus producing cells in that area, and that particular area of the stomach is not protected, and you can see that the pepsin and acid is burning a hole right through the stomach. So although H. pylori is the root cause of stomach ulcers, there are things that can cause the ulcers to flare up in some people. So things like smoking, caffeine, stress. Okay, these are things that impact your immune system and can impact your ability to fight off this bacteria. Now, after a few hours, again, depending on what your meal is made up of, after a couple of hours, the food that you ate is basically ground up into this thick paste, this acidic paste. Really, it would be like if you took a hamburger, put it in a blender, mixed it with acid and pepsin and mucus, and pressed high speed on that blender, right? That's kind of what the contents of your stomach looks like after a few hours. And we call this stuff chyme. C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. Now, a good question on a test would be, What would we find in chyme? What macromolecules would we find in chyme? Would we find starch in chyme? 100% we would. Let's say you ate a hamburger. Okay? Would we find starch in chyme? Yes, we would. Because starch gets digested a little bit in your mouth, not fully, just a little bit. The remainder of the starch would still be in your stomach. Does it get digested in your stomach? No. Would we find fat in chyme? Yep, because fat does not get digested in your mouth and it does not get digested in your stomach. Would we find gigantic big proteins in there? No. Pepsin has taken the big proteins and untwisted them and kind of chopped them up a bit. Would we find polypeptides in the chyme? Yes. Would we find disaccharides in the chyme? Yes. Would we find monosaccharides in the chyme? Yes. Okay? The only thing that we wouldn't find in there are big proteins. They've been digested.